Okay, so how can God allow suffering? I guess that question might be asked from two different angles. Somebody might ask that question from the position of looking out on a world that is full of hurt and suffering and evil and think, how can God allow all of this from a kind of general perspective? You know, how did the world get to be like this? And we'll think about how the Bible responds to that in a moment. But I guess others, though, might ask that question from a much more specific, acute place of personal suffering. You know, how could God allow my nan to suffer and die from COVID like she did? How could God allow my sister-in-law to lose her baby like that? How could God allow me to endure this relationship breakdown with my spouse? One of the things that I appreciate about the Bible is that it is full of people who come face to face with the reality of suffering and are asking precisely those sorts of questions. Doesn't shy away from it. Of people who cry out to God, why are you letting this happen to me? Now, one of them was a chap called Job. Maybe you've heard of him. And Job, if you read about him in the Bible, he went through the mill in terms of suffering. He lost his family in a freak accident. He got really sick. His business went under. He lost all his savings. And the Bible describes how Job's friends, they sit down with him and they try and give him a whole load of reasons why God has allowed this to happen to him. They try and give Job the answer to this exact question of why God has allowed this suffering in his life. But then after multiple chapters, God eventually speaks. And God's response is perhaps surprising, because it's not to explain to Job why Job is going through what he's going through, but rather to help Job to see how God is unimaginably greater and bigger than Job could ever begin to imagine, and therefore to trust him even in the midst of his suffering. And that's a really important place for us to begin today, because look, if you're here hoping for a specific answer as to why God is allowing you to go through the particular suffering that you're going through now, then I'm afraid the Bible is quiet on that. But please stay with me, okay? Please don't turn off just yet, because what the Bible does do is direct us in the midst of our suffering to a God who is in control, to a God who is compassionate and loving, and to a God who holds all of history in his hands. And this gives us a framework to deal with suffering in a way that nothing else does, even if we never know all of the answers of why God might have allowed it to happen. And so today we're just going to look at the Bible and we're going to think about why suffering is even an issue in the first place and see the reason why we find it so painful. Then we're going to wonderfully consider how God doesn't just ignore us in our plight. No, quite the opposite. In love, he steps down to share with us in our suffering and deal with it once and for all. And we'll consider how God gives us a sure hope in the midst of our suffering as we look ahead to the future. Okay, so that's where we're going to be going for the rest of our time. So firstly then, let's think about why suffering is even an issue in the first place and quite why we find it so painful. Now, before we try and think about how the Bible tackles that, I just want us to take a moment to think about other approaches that people might take to explain suffering. Maybe you've heard these different approaches before, because the thing is, everyone's got to address the issue somehow. It's a universal problem, whether you're a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a secular atheist, or you're kind of on the fence and you don't really know what you are. The question of suffering, it doesn't just go away. We can't just try and turn the volume down and pretend it's not an issue. It needs to be dealt with. And so let me just take two of the ways of thinking which are probably perhaps most common in our society as we think about these things. Firstly, what about the Buddhist approach to suffering? Now, versions of Buddhism are increasingly popular amongst 21st century Westerners who want something of the transcendent without the religious structure of Christianity. Lots of our self-help guides, our popular kind of meditation practices, they borrow from a Buddhist worldview. So what does Buddhism say about suffering? Well, within Buddhism, suffering is just an illusion. And so in order to liberate yourself from the pain of suffering, you're encouraged to detach yourself from reality as a way to gain enlightenment and peace. You know, transcend above the illusion of suffering and you'll be okay. But there's a huge issue there, isn't there? Because if we're honest, suffering really doesn't feel like an illusion. If your spouse has cheated on you or the tumor's returned, to say that the suffering and pain you feel is just an illusion, well, that doesn't chime with the reality of what we're experiencing. It denies our feelings and emotions, which we know to be all too real in the face of of grief and pain. Okay, well, how about the secular atheist approach then? This is the box that an increasing number would tick on the census, isn't it? If you want to know what the high priest of secular atheism thinks about suffering, here's Richard Dawkins in his book, River Out of Eden. Maybe you've read it. He writes this. He says, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get lucky and some people are going to get hurt, and we won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. There's a cheery quote for your Sunday. But that's where you end up, right? Because the atheist who is consistent with his or her beliefs doesn't wrestle with the idea of why suffering might seem unfair or harsh. It just is. Get over it. It's pointless. We're all a bundle of atoms. There is no good or evil. Just try instead to maximize your happiness. But again, there's a huge issue there, okay? Because we intrinsically feel that there is such a thing as good and evil, that there is a moral fabric to the universe, which means that we get shaken to the core when injustice occurs or when people die or when disaster strikes. And so to say that there's no rhyme or reason to it seems far too shallow compared to our lived experience and what we seem to know deep down about the reality of human existence. Okay, so that's a Buddhist and an atheist answer to suffering in a nutshell. How does the Bible explain suffering to us? And as we look at it now, I just want you to think if this big story that the Bible paints is a better fit with your own experience. Now, we need to start right at the beginning of the Bible, and right from the off we see in Genesis 1 and 2 that the world was made by God. That has to be the starting point. Okay, first sentence in the whole Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, don't worry about the mechanics of how the world was made. That's not the point of these opening chapters. The point is that God made everything, and that everything he made was good. We read in Genesis 1, carrying on, of how God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. This was a world without death or suffering. It was the world as it was meant to be. It was the world we all want. There was no coronaviruses or cancers. There was no riots or rheumatoid arthritis. It was a good, very good world that God made. And into this good world, God created people, men and women, designed to live under his good rule in right relationship with him, with one another, and with the created world around us. But then tragedy struck. And if you read on in Genesis 3, it describes what happens and what has gone on happening ever since, of how humanity chose to turn away from God, to rebel against him, to reject his good rule. It's what the Bible calls sin. And this decision to turn away from God and his good rule, it impacted everything. It meant humanity's relationship with God was fractured. And it meant our relationship with one another was fractured as we began living for ourselves. And so suffering as a result of moral evil just started to snowball. And it meant our relationship with the world around us was fractured. We read elsewhere in the Bible that the whole earth was impacted by humanity's decision to turn from God. The Apostle Paul writes that because of sin, creation was subjected to frustration, and that since that day, the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth. That's a pretty apt description, isn't it, for how our world seems to be right now? The frustrated groans of a world that is not how it was made to be, of natural disasters and deadly viruses and sick children and infertility, all signs that the world we live in is broken. And so actually, these opening chapters of Genesis give us an indication as to just why suffering hurts so much, because this isn't how it was meant to be. We were made for something so much better, for life in perfect relationship with God, with one another and with the world around us, and yet we feel the very real pain of living in a world that is scarred by the effects of sin. And look, this is a view of suffering that doesn't deny its existence like Buddhism, doesn't deny the very concept of good and evil like secular atheism. It rightly explains why the world is the way it is and just why we find it so hard. Now, at this point, you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, Tom, this isn't exactly helping. I'm well aware that we live in a broken world. I feel that in my own life right now. But my question's still the same, given our broken world. If there is a God, why hasn't he done anything about it? It seems like he doesn't care. Well, that's where we have to go to the central point in human history to see, secondly, what God has done about suffering. Where Jesus, the God-man, he comes and he suffers in our place. And here is where the Christian answer to the question of suffering is unlike anything else you will ever hear. That God does not look on in cold indifference at the suffering of the world he has made, but that he came to earth in the person of Jesus to share in our sufferings and to deal with the root issue of our suffering once and for all through his death on the cross. Let's just look at those 2 points in turn. Okay, firstly, the cross shows us that God is with us in our suffering. Have you ever considered that the God of the Bible knows how you feel when you walk through suffering? If you read the closing chapters of each of the 4 historical accounts of Jesus' life in the Bible, you'll see the suffering of Jesus recorded in great detail. You'll see that he suffered relationally. The Bible records how he was betrayed by his closest of friends, how he was abandoned in his hour of need. That means that Jesus knows what it's like to have those closest to him walk away from him. You'll see that he suffered emotionally and mentally. He endured relentless mocking and scorn and verbal abuse. He was taunted and maligned and endured a terrible miscarriage of justice. He stood in front of a crowd who bayed for him to be strung up and to be crucified. That means that Jesus knows what it's like to face the emotional and the mental torment of being hated by people. And of course, you'll see that he suffered physically. He was nailed to a wooden cross and he was left to die, having been beaten up and flogged for hours by a group of ruthless Roman soldiers. And so that means that Jesus knows what it's like to feel the physical agony of a body that is racked with pain and to slowly die from it. I was reading last week about a lady called Joni Eareckson Tada, who when she was 17 years old, she dived into a lake that was too shallow and she fractured her spine and she became paralyzed for life. Just listen to what she says, okay, reflecting on life as a paraplegic. She's well into her 70s now, all right, and she writes these poignant words. She says, I discovered that the Lord Jesus Christ could indeed empathize with my situation. On the cross for those agonizing, horrible hours, waiting for death, he was immobilized, helpless, paralyzed. Jesus did know what it was like not to be able to move, not to be able to scratch your nose or shift your weight or wipe your eyes. He was paralyzed on the cross. Christ knew exactly how I felt. And so here's the rub. As we look back to the cross, we see that the God of the Bible, he knows what suffering's about, not just because he's God and so he knows everything, but because he's experienced it. The God of the Bible is not aloof or cold or ignorant of the suffering that we face. No, as Joni writes, she says, God wrote the book on suffering and he called it Jesus. And this means God understands. He knows. He's with me. And so even though we might not understand why God is allowing us to go through what we're going through, the cross shows us that God is with us in our suffering. But that's not the only thing, because Jesus' suffering is way more than just God being empathetic. When we go to see the doctor when we're seriously ill, we want more than empathy and a gentle bedside manner, as important as those things might be. Fundamentally, when we go to the doctor, we want the doctor to fix the problem. And that's exactly what's happening at the cross. Okay, second point, the cross shows us that God came to deal with our suffering. And by the way, if you're new to all this, this is the thumping heart of the Christian faith, that at the cross, Jesus came to swap places with us. That he came to suffer and to die, and in so doing, to take upon himself the punishment that we deserved for our rebellion against God. Just listen to this sentence in the Bible. It's written by the Apostle Peter. Okay, it tells us why Jesus suffered on the cross. He writes this, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God." You see, God gave up his Son, the righteous one, to suffer a cruel death on a cross, not just so that he could empathize with us in our suffering, but so that we, the unrighteous, could be brought back to right relationship with God, so that we could be saved for eternity with God in paradise forever. It is the greatest act of love that there's ever been. And it was for you and it was for me. And so here's the thing to spot. Okay, while the Bible might not tell us why God allows specific things to happen to us in our lives, it does tell us that the suffering we face cannot be that God doesn't love us. He has already demonstrated the extent of his love for us as we see Jesus, his son, dying in our place, and that means that we can trust him. But that's not all, okay, because our next question off the back of that may well be, well, that's all very well and good, but what hope does that give me now in the face of my suffering? Well, we haven't quite finished the story, because you see, Jesus died to swap places with us, but he didn't stay dead. The gospel writers record, and hundreds of eyewitnesses testify to the fact that he rose from the dead 3 days later. And that is a game changer, okay, because that means that for the follower of Jesus, there is now hope for the future. We began with words from the very beginning of the Bible. Let me now read to you some words from right at the end. Okay, these are found in the book of Revelation, right at the end of the Bible. And actually, before I read them, let me just give you the context of when this was written. John, the author, he was one of Jesus' disciples. He's writing this in a time where the Roman Emperor Domitian was persecuting Christians like there was no tomorrow. Okay, you can read about this in the history books. And Domitian was a tyrant. These early Christians were having their homes taken away and ransacked. They were being sent into the gladiatorial arena to be mauled by lions. Some of these Christians were impaled on stakes and they'd have their bodies covered in tar and set on fire. This is what those reading the letter that John was writing were facing. Okay, these guys knew suffering. They knew suffering. Listen to these words that John writes them. Okay, this is what the death and the resurrection of Jesus secures. John writes this. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." And then he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." These are some of my favorite words in the entire Bible, of how the Christian looks forward to a day when every tear is wiped away, when there's no more funerals, there's no more bedside vigils, there's no more flashing blue lights and wailing sirens, there's no more relational breakdown, there is no more weeping in the middle of the night. All of that will be gone, and it will all be made new. It is a place where, in the words of Tolkien, everything sad is going to come untrue. Author and speaker Tim Keller puts it like this, of what is in store for the Christian. Reflecting on those words in Revelation, he writes, "The most rapturous delight you ever had in the beauty of a landscape, or in the pleasure of food, or in the fulfillment of a loving embrace are like dewdrops compared to the bottomless ocean of joy that it will be to see God face to face." That is what we're in for, nothing less. And friend, this is the hope for all who trust in Jesus, that one day suffering and evil will be no more. And look, this isn't just wishful thinking, okay? This is not a placebo to help us get through the pain of now. This is reasoned, rational thinking because it is based on the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, and that is obviously a huge if, okay? Who's ever heard of someone coming back to life again after being dead 3 days? But if he did, then it changes everything. Because it means I can have confidence that his work on the cross was effective. It means that I can have assurance that resurrected life in heaven with God is not a vague pipe dream, but it is concrete reality because Jesus is already there, living it now. And that hope completely reframes my suffering now. It means when I face grief or trials of various kinds, and as I find myself crying out to God in the watch of the night and saying, "Why, God, are you allowing this to happen?" Yes, I grieve and I ask questions and I lament, but I don't do it without hope. The death of Jesus in my place, restoring me back to relationship with God, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, giving me the assurance of eternal life in paradise with God forever. This grants me confident hope for the future, whatever might come now. Okay. How do we pull all these threads together? There's a line in the Bible written by the Apostle Paul, which I think really helps us as we think about a Christian approach to suffering. If you know anything about Paul, you'll know that he was a guy who went through some of the worst kinds of trial. He was regularly beaten up. He was arrested on false charges. He was shipwrecked multiple times. He was abused. He was bitten by snakes. He worked night and day with little or no money. He was homeless on occasion. The list just goes on and on. And reflecting on his suffering, he writes to this church in a place called Corinth of how he is hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. And I love that sentence because I think it captures the Christian approach to suffering really well. Let's just work through it. Let's apply it to us now. Okay, hard-pressed. Yeah, absolutely. I feel the pressure coming in at me from every side and it is almost too much to bear. I can hardly breathe at times. Hard-pressed, but not crushed. I know that Jesus is with me. He's sustaining me each day. He's leading me home to heaven. I'm perplexed. God, I don't know why you're allowing this to happen to me or to them now. It doesn't make sense and it hurts and I'm finding it really hard. I'm perplexed, but not in despair. God, though I don't know why you're allowing this to happen and it is killing me, as I look to the cross, I know with confident assurance that you care for me and you love me to the utmost and that it is not hopeless. Persecuted. God, this suffering doesn't feel fair. It is unjust and I feel out of my depth and I feel on my own. Persecuted, but not abandoned. God, I know you promised never to leave me or forsake me, even as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And that Jesus is my guarantee of that because he's walked that path ahead of me. Struck down, the crippling illness, the verbal attack, the car accident that leaves you in a hospital bed, unable to move and barely breathing, the reality of suffering, struck down, but not destroyed. God, thank you that the resurrection of Jesus means that even if the worst thing that can possibly happen to me happens and I die, it only serves me now to go to be with you in paradise forever. And so let me ask you, are you feeling hard-pressed? Crushed by life? Perplexed at everything that's happening? Persecuted perhaps? Struck down? I hope you've begun to see how the message of the Bible is radical in the way it approaches the issue of suffering. Though we might not have all the answers, it helps us understand why suffering is even a reality in the first place. It's not just an illusion. It's not because of faulty DNA. Living in a world marred by sin is real and it is hard. But the Bible shows us that God isn't indifferent or disinterested, but that he chose to suffer with us and wonderfully for us. And it gives us a glimpse into a future of a wonderful, indescribable, weighty hope that is on offer for all who turn to Christ in repentance and faith. Now, what we've been considering today, okay, this isn't just abstract theory. This is real life for lots of people. And so we're just going to hear the story now of a couple who attend Dundonald Church and something of their journey over the last year and how the message of the Christian faith that we've considered today has strengthened them in the midst of their suffering.
Carl and Hayley, thank you so much for joining us today and to share a bit about your story. You're both from South Africa. You came across the UK 12, 13 years ago or so. And you've been coming along to Dundonald now for how long?
9 or 10 years.
9 or 10 years, okay. We've been thinking today about suffering and reflecting on the Christian perspective on suffering. I know that you guys have travelled through a hard year or so. Do you want to just tell us a bit about the journey that you've been travelling over the last year?
Yeah, sure. So a little over a year ago, we found out that we were expecting our second daughter, Evie. When we went for the 12-week scan, we were told that there was probably something serious wrong. And then a short while later, we got the news that she had Edwards syndrome, which is a severe chromosomal problem. Affects lots of different parts of the body. And as we went for more and more scans, we were sort of faced with ever-increasing complexities and difficult diagnoses, and it was just a very hard time not knowing what was going to happen.
Yeah, I think that news was devastating for us, really, because once you know anything about Edwards syndrome, you know that it is severe and life expectancy is really low, and it feels a bit hopeless. Actually, I think that was a real blow for us. It was really, really, really hard, and it's always, I think, at the back of your mind, something that you never expect might happen to you until it does. I suppose, like all suffering. Yeah. So Evie was born on my birthday earlier this year. Yeah, we had a very precious time with her for a few hours.
It's obviously been an incredibly hard year for you both to navigate through that with little Evie, alongside everything that's been going on around the world with a pandemic. We mentioned at the start that you've both been Christians for 9 or 10 years. Just tell us a bit about how being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus, has shaped the way you've navigated through this last year or so.
It didn't take away how hard it was. It was so sad, but I can honestly say that Jesus walked with us every single step of the way, and that was a huge, huge comfort and hope, to know that Jesus, who knows suffering more than anybody, who has suffered more than any of us can ever imagine, and who has walked this path of suffering on this planet, but also who is the God of the universe, is with us. And so that's huge, and that he's alongside us, I think, every single step of the way. And he met us in every single moment. He met us every single day. And even though we were suffering, he was right there. So we had a friend in Jesus. We had somebody, I think, just the fact that Jesus knows us so intimately was huge for us, that he understood everything that we were going through. He understood our daughter. He understood who we are, and he understood the situation. And there was nothing we had to explain. So that was really a huge comfort. And then also the fact that it wasn't just like having this incredible friend, but because he's the God of the universe, he also had us. He had our whole situation. So he knew what was going to happen. He'd gone before us. Nothing was a surprise to him. He knew everything about the scans. He knew more than any of the doctors could know. He knew how we were feeling. He knew what would happen, and actually just handing that over was an amazing thing to do.
And I think for me also, knowing that God knows Evie, and has known Evie since before time, that the Bible promises us that, was a huge comfort for me, for both of us, and knowing that we'll see her again, was huge. That she's with Jesus now, and we'll get to see her again one day. So it's temporary for us. It's hard, but we'll get to see her.
It's not a journey that's over, and we are still suffering, and it is still really hard. But every day we can come to Jesus. He's always there. He's never, we don't have to make an appointment or arrange a Zoom call. We can just speak to him. And I think that's so comforting, to come to him in prayer, and to also to have what we have in God's word, and to remind ourselves of those truths. That's, I think, at times when I did feel probably the lowest and the furthest away from God, going back to those truths in the Bible and just reminding us of those was very powerful to hold on to. Yeah.
Carl and Hayley, thank you so much for sharing something of your story with us today. I know it's not always or ever straightforward to sit down and do this sort of thing, let alone to film. So thank you so much for being willing to share your story.